my name is Chuan. I'm here to talk about machine learning engineer, and here's my LinkedIn link if you want to connect with me or ask more questions. I think before I start, I want to introduce myself, my career path that you will see on my resume so that you understand my experience in machine learning and just as a software engineer in general. I have started in, I guess, a machine learning related field since 2002, and that was when I started become interested in speech. So I was in Taiwan at the time, and I was doing masters, and I was very interested in this class that a professor taught about speech recognition. So after taking the class, I joined the lab to do my master's there. And originally, my main interest was about speech recognition, natural language processing. But one thing I didn't think about at the time was like a lot of the component that was used in speech recognition was machine learning. And I guess, hidden Markov model was a big thing at the time. Because I want to learn more about speech processing, I ended up learning a lot about machine learning, pattern recognition, etc. And then after my master's, I continued to be interested in natural language processing. So I applied for a bunch of PhD programs in the US, and I came to Stanford for my CS PhD. Went to the natural language processing lab at Stanford for 5 years, mostly working on machine translation. And because I came from Taiwan, my native language is Chinese. So I'm actually very interested in topics that involves multiple languages. So my thesis was actually on Chinese to English translation. And then after that, I think after that experience at academia, I decided that I actually was more interested in applied field. So I went to industry. I started my first job at Google in 2009. I was there for 4 years. Most of my time there was actually working on things related to NLP and some personalization work. So mostly, I think all my 4 years there were things related to machine learning, natural language processing. Then after 4 years at Google, I had the opportunity to work in a startup called Alt School. So this is 2013. This is interesting because the title there was research engineer, but this is actually my only job so far that doesn't use machine learning. So it's a startup. It's it's focused on education and actually like K-8 education. So I ended up working on basically whatever was needed in the startup, which at the time was a lot of front end, and I picked up JavaScript during that year when I was there. And I'll go into some of the details of how it's related to machine learning engineering. But then afterwards, I came back to bigger companies, LinkedIn, for a little over a year, and then I came back to Google recently. Well, not recently, sorry. I came back to Google after that, and I've been here for 3 years. I want to share my own personal story of like why I become a machine learning engineer. And as I mentioned before, initially it was actually the interest in natural language. I want to understand, starting from speech recognition and just like the general natural language processing. So here are two figures. I just find them interesting to look at. Two figures from my papers in the past. Basically, the first one is from Chinese to English. How do we use the syntactic structure of the two languages to help inform better translation? And this one is from a paper that I did in a Microsoft internship back in 2006. It was between the language pair of English and Japanese. So overall, my starting point was that I was really interested in this application, which is basically language. And in the process of studying language, I think, I happened to study language in the natural language in a time where a lot of statistical methods were used. So learning machine learning, learning all these statistical methods was very important for understanding and apply these NLP applications. So that covers from my time in starting from when I was in National Taiwan University, going to Stanford, and my first job at Google. And then I mentioned that after, I guess, 2 years of master's, 5 years of PhD, and 4 years at Google, I decided to just not do machine learning when I went to the startup. I think this is because I really love education. Starting from when I was at Stanford, I started volunteering to teach middle school girls programming. I'm just like in general very fascinated by how people learn, how people teach. When I was at Google, I heard about this opportunity at Alt School. At the time, they were trying to start schools and also build software for them. So it just sounds so fascinating for me, and I decided to join them. And I remember even when I was quitting Google, a lot of my friends at Google asked me, well, but they don't have machine learning. What are you going to do there? It was a good question. I think it actually eventually it was why I left all school is I realized that I actually didn't like front-end engineering as much personally. And I did at the time, miss my job in machine learning. That's actually why I eventually left all school. But overall, it was still a very good experience for me because having been in academia and Google, the first 4 years at Google, mostly in Google research, I think I have not seen a world that is like the startup world and a world that is not completely focused on machine learning. It was a great experience for me because I have a lot of exposure to different roles such as front-end engineers, designers, and even like admissions at school, teachers. So it has been a great experience for me, even though it was not machine learning related. But then I mentioned that I think at the end of the year at all school, I realized that I love everything about working there, almost everything, but I actually didn't like my job as an engineer that much because I had to pick up JavaScript, which was fascinating. But in terms of like the engineering crafts that I do, it's not the type of craft that I like the best. So I decided to come back and seek a machine learning engineer job again. And then so at the time I thought one issue at all school was at the time that they didn't, like, unlike the other companies that have like websites that have a lot of traffic, they actually didn't have that much data to work with. So I decided that I want to come back and work in bigger companies. I went to LinkedIn at the time. I really like LinkedIn's mission. Like, they want to connect the world's professionals and make them more productive. And I think for me, a person who likes education, it actually seems like a very natural mission to have. Is like, how do you make people more productive and learn more in the workplace? And also because the reason why I wanted to switch is because I want to do machine learning again. So I joined the org. I don't know what they're called now, but at the time it's called the Relevance org. The whole org is focusing on applying machine learning on various LinkedIn products. So that was after the startup. I came to LinkedIn for a while. And after LinkedIn, I came back to Google. And this is the same. I think I continue to want to find a role as a machine learning engineer and scientist. This time I came back to Google Research. And so I have been at Google 3 years this time. I actually have switched team once. The first team was on natural language processing. So it was more similar to what I was doing before. But like in the past 2 years, I switched to a new team to explore machine learning in a new field, which is genomics. So this is, I think I used to say that I'm new in this field, but now I've been on this team for 2 years. I guess I can't say that anymore, but it still feels very new because the last biology class I took was actually back in high school when I was in Taiwan. I had to learn a lot and continue to learn a lot in computational biology and how to apply machine learning to it. Okay, so that is a long introduction of me and where I come from, how my journey is like in school and also in work and the machine learning related experience. And I think I actually don't have that many more slides, but I want to talk about, in this whole process, what are the skills that I found useful? This is obviously coming from my perspective, and people have more questions. We can talk about that later. I think the programming languages are important, and some people might ask what languages. When I was at Stanford, the Stanford NLP group is mostly using Java, at least back when I was there. I don't know if they use more Python now just because of deep learning framework. But back in the days, it was mostly Java. They have a repository called Java NLP, which is open. I think it might be open source now. Actually, it was open. Anyway, it was in Java. When I am at Google, most of the project I use used to be mostly C++. But nowadays, because of TensorFlow, a lot of the projects now use a lot more Python. Like the open source project that I work on right now is a mix of Python and C++. I mentioned that when I was in the startup, I work mostly on front end, so I did a lot of JavaScript at the time, which is very fascinating. I think it's very different and very interesting. And also, if you want to be a machine learning engineer, I think you need to know about the model and how they work. Even that have many different aspects. I think when I was in school, the classes I took focused more on explaining the theory, the math behind it, which I think is quite important. But I think as I go into more industry, those knowledge they're still important, because a lot of times when you when you encounter a problem of why a model doesn't work or how do you need to tweak it, you need to have some understanding how the model works. But I think overall, when I'm in industry, a lot of it becomes how you deal with these models empirically, right? Like how do you design an experiment? How do you define your training and testing data? Like a lot of the experimental aspect, I think you would only learn from having done hands-on experience, which I think is why that for these machine learning classes that you take, you need to know the basics, the theory, but you also need to do hands-on project to be able to really have experience with these models and how to use it. So like the whole process of how you would define, how you would understand a problem to design machine learning models to address the issues that you're trying to address, to actually evaluate whether you're making progress, which I think is almost the first thing that I ask is like, how do you measure progress on your model, right? Then you can iterate and, design a new approach and iterate on the metrics that you have. So I think this part is very important. It can be learned from classes, but then again, I think it's very important to do hands-on project. And the third part is machine learning infrastructure. So my first job is at Google, and then I had the advantage of directly learning from a big company that has great infrastructure. It's not just machine learning infrastructure, it's like infrastructure in general, right? How do you deal with larger data set in an effective way? Because one thing I've seen a lot of machine learning people is like, sometimes if you don't have the experience to deal with larger data set, you might have the ability to iterate on smaller data set, but a lot of times people get blocked on how can the turnaround time be faster when the data set is bigger. So that's when the infrastructure knowledge is very important. I also want to say that I mentioned these things, but it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in everything in order to work on machine learning. I think a lot of times it's also the people that you work with. I think of myself as having decent knowledge of all of these things, but I'm actually not an expert in all of these, right? So sometimes when I work on a problem that actually requires much more sophisticated infrastructure, I would go and consult my colleagues who are much more infrastructure experts than I am. So I think having enough knowledge to do these things yourself, but also having enough knowledge to know who to ask when you are blocked by something. And that leads to my fourth point, which is communication skills. This is very important for all engineers, not just machine learning engineers. The idea is that when you have an idea, when you're solving a problem, it often feels easier if you just do all of this in your head and you don't have to talk to other people. But the reality is that writing these design docs, getting other people to review your code or reviewing other people's code or making a presentation actually helps you clarify your thoughts. Sometimes I have an idea and I'll think through it in my head, but when I try to explain it to others, it actually becomes much more clear, and a lot of the details or questions that I had actually becomes much more clear, and then I know how to solve them better. So I think all these are important, and this is also very important for just communicating with people what you're up to right now. They know how to help you, or they know how to give you feedback. Over time, I think as I become more experienced, I noticed that being able to run a team, like I currently have a team for my project, we have a few people. So how do you run these meetings effectively? How do you communicate with each other more effectively so that people feel involved and people know what each other's doing is very important. Generally important skills, I think, for all software engineers. I think about this a lot, which is, machine learning is really popular these days, and for me, I have been, doing machine learning for a long time. So a lot of times people are like, oh, it's really cool, like machine learning, deep learning. But for me, machine learning really is a tool that allows me to solve problems. And it's just like general software engineering practice, like being able to write code, to automate things, to do things faster or in a more systematic way, is the tools that I have that help me solve problems. That sounds really general and vague. And I think back in the days before I joined the startup, when I told my friends, when they asked me, well, what are you going to do? They don't have machine learning problems, right? I think at the time I thought, it doesn't matter what type of problems. Like, I want to solve problems that I care about. I think this is still true. It's very important that I solve problems that I want to solve and care about. But on the other hand, I think my startup experience, the non-machine learning one, also taught me that there are different kind of jobs that a person can do. And as an engineer, I am not just in general interested in all sorts of engineering. I mean, I can do them. It doesn't mean that they're the type of craft that I like the most, right? I think when I was in a startup, I think I was talking to a coworker how I don't really enjoy front-end engineering that much. And he was trying to explain to me that front-end engineering is like carpentry. You need to polish it, you need to improve it, and you need to like that process. And I think when he was telling me that, I was thinking to myself, you're absolutely right. But I also realized that front-end engineering is not really the craft that I like, basically. So I really like more is to deal with data, to not necessarily machine learning, right? But like to be able to think about data and, apply a machine learning model, just some analytics on it to understand it better. So that's the type of craft I like. When I think of what I can do best, and I want what type of, if I were to find a next job, a next team, what would I want to do? I think this is my guiding principle now, is that I want to work on problems that I want to solve, that I care about, that I think are real problems. But I also want to find problems that has the components that my skill can contribute to. I think one thing I learned in the startup is also that I don't think I can really be a full-time teacher, because at least, right now, I don't have the skills to be a full-time teacher. So, I want, at this point of my life, I want to be working on a job where it has components that my current skill can contribute to, but I can always also grow new skills on the job. And that's the third part, which is that I want a job that allows me to work with people that I can learn from. So I can contribute to the team, but at the same time, I can also learn new skills from other people on the team. I think this is a question many people ask me. How do you bootstrap your skills? If you want to get into the machine learning field, what would you do? Again, here's just my personal thoughts. Everyone has different experience. Maybe we can discuss and talk about that later. But my feeling is that if you're earlier in your career, like you are still a generalist, you don't have it's not like you are super experiencing one thing yet. I think you should consider more like taking classes, either online, in person, and definitely are actively participate in project, and make sure that you put your projects on places publicly that people can see, so that people can, for more exposure in case you want to apply for jobs or something, that would be really helpful. I think the second category is actually one that I got asked more, is like people who have been in the industry already for a while, but not in machine learning. And a lot of times these people have, already sometimes quite established in their own type of software engineering, but they want to learn machine learning. And then they come to ask me what they should do. My advice is that if possible, I understand this is not necessarily easy to find, but I think the best way is to learn on the job if possible. And usually that means going into a team that machine learning is its core mission, but at the same time, it might need some expertise that you have, right? Like I've known an SRE, DevOps kind of person, SRE, site reliability engineer, that got into a team because a machine learning team had needs for that kind of expertise on the team. I think that's definitely a good way. But then obviously when you get on the team, you need to balance how much you contribute with your existing skills and how much you can take opportunity to learn from the team. I also have heard people said, sometimes it might end up that you still continue to do what you did before. And if you find it really difficult to find an opportunity to learn on the job, then you can still also take classes and participate in project. This also takes time, right? Like I think not everyone has the luxury of to just quit your job and take a full-time class. So a lot of times people would still do whatever their full-time job is and do these at the same time. If you really have the luxury to get education again, you could also consider like more formal training, getting a master's or something like that. That's the end of my slides. If you have any questions, please let me know.
It's Tasha. And then anyone else, feel free to ask questions in the chat. But I guess the first question, I'll give it to someone else. How are the interview process for research scientists / ML engineer different than software engineer positions at Google?
Okay, I can answer for the research scientist position. So I am personally a software engineer. I know that the research scientist position, first of all, it requires a PhD. So you have to have a PhD to apply for a research scientist position. How is it different? So first of all, one difference is that you need to give a job talk. So I think that is one difference, that most software engineers are not required to give a job talk. And research scientists, so usually, and I'm speaking from my past experience, which if they have changed recently, then I wouldn't know. But software engineer usually have multiple interviews throughout the day. And then usually there will be coding interviews and some kind of system design interviews if you're more senior software engineers. But research scientists, I think they would swap some of the system design ones to be more research focused. Machine learning engineer is actually, I think this title only appears in the past few years. And I believe what happened is that then similarly, they will make sure that some of your interviews in interview day, there will be specifically covering machine learning type of problems. So I think that's the difference in the interview process. And I think the research scientist is much more different because it requires job talk. And I think even the process of giving, I think it might be done by a different committee, but I'm speaking of this, I'm not involved in any of this committee, so I'm just mostly from my observation from how other people go through the process. Okay, so this next question, any recommendations on online coursework? There are so many. I actually don't know. Maybe other people on this chat, on this talk, if you have recommended online work, because as I mentioned, like I started from school back in college, right? So I actually haven't really had to take any of these classes. So how important are other tools such as, right? Overall, I think because I recommend learning things from the work, so it would really depend on what your job requires. If you're learning these things before you get into a job, right? Then I think I would really think it's really useful to think about which companies are using what tool and how popular, especially for like open source tools, how popular are they in the community. I think there is actually a lot of benefit to learn things that are popular at the time, mostly because that if you have any questions, like if you search on the internet, like a lot more answers will come up for that particular tool. It's a little bit weird to say that, recommend things based on the popularity at the time. But if something has been popular for a while, you probably have a better chance of, learning more just from the internet. And also, have a better chance that more companies will be using it. But yeah, I think tools are important. It's just like there's so many tools, you can't really aim to learn all of them.
Yeah, it's Tasha. I'm really interested in your project management and just the concept of how long does some of these projects take? Because then there's a certain mindset of y'all, like you're right, like you talk about build it and all that. So I think I'm interested in that.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because I came from my PhD directly into Google Research. And I think back in 2009, I feel like Google Research was not as organized now. And even now, I think in research project, there are just a big range of timeline. I personally, even though I seem to come from like a research background, I want to work on things that are much more applied. And for me, anything that, when I was looking for a job last time, some of the projects were basically the person described to me like, oh, this company is working on this project that have like a 10-year timeline. And I was immediately like, please, no, right? It's not for me. Like, I think for me, if anything that doesn't have a clear deliverable, at least in a year, it's just like not for me. But everyone in research is very different because I know many people in research, they want to be working on things that are aiming for multiple years in the future. And I have to be honest that I personally don't know how to manage that. So, which is also a reason why I think I want to have clear milestone in a year and be able to kind of backtrack what all the checkpoints are that to achieve that goal in a year. But it's very different in different research groups. Most more product-oriented machine learning groups will usually still aim for like quarterly deliverables. That's my experience.
All right, thank you. There are 2 more questions in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this one, I think I have an answer. Participate in Kaggle. I actually have not participated in Kaggle. I think it's great. I have know many friends who participate in it. It's actually, yeah, that's a good point. I think if you have already taken some machine learning or have some machine learning experience and want to really like showcase your ability, I think participating in Kaggle is great. But since I haven't done it myself, I can't really, provide tips for that. But I think it's a great place to showcase your ability. What are my favorite NLP papers? Wow. Okay. I did my PhD before this whole neural, like deep learning thing came out. And I think back in the times, there were many, but I just couldn't remember. I think I was doing like a qualifying exam and we had to read through all these parsing papers and semantics papers. And I actually just enjoy them all. I think maybe I can find the list, but a lot of them are really old. For the newer ones, a lot of the ones that are recommended by, a lot of the classes, which are the ones that I like. Sorry, I can't think of them right now. Maybe you can connect with me afterwards as well. There are definitely a few I like. I think I tend to like papers that connect, like the math, the theory into some language related intuition, right? Like I think the word2vec thing it was interesting when it came out, because I was thinking about how these embeddings are related to, in the past, the lexical semantics, and it was just very fascinating. PhD or master's required? They are not required. I think they help. Mostly, why do they help? Okay, so PhD help because usually by the time you get a PhD, and if it's in machine learning, that usually means you have already, done very deep investigation into a machine learning related project, right? So I think that's why having a PhD in machine learning would help, because people feel like, okay, you have proven that you can do really, really deep investigation and become world expert in a topic. Masters usually help, I think, because, I know many people from Stanford master's program that specialize in AI. I think having that means that you have taken all the required classes, and like I said, prove that you probably have done a lot of the projects, right? So I think that it helps in that sense, but they're definitely not required. And even at Google in research, I have seen many people who came in just with an undergrad degree, and yet I actually know a few people who have only an undergrad degree but probably read more recent papers than I do. So it's definitely not required, but it will probably get it's if you haven't been to a particular place, it might be a place, it might be something that people use to more easily say that you're probably qualified because you probably have taken these classes or you probably have done bigger projects in this field. But no, they're not required. From mentee to mentoring a project. My experience at Google is that, so at Google there is this not official title called tech lead, right? So you're a technical lead of a project. Maybe because the way Google, especially research, works, I think early on in my career, I often work on projects mostly led by myself. Like I don't know, like I was basically expected to be independent and quote unquote leading something, but sometimes I'm the only person on the project. So in many ways, I think even early on in my career, and maybe this is also the PhD training, like you are supposed to lead your own project, even when you are the only person on the team. It's an interesting question of how you transition from being a tech lead of your own to a tech lead of a group. And for me, I don't think it was deliberate, but like I happened to, when I first become a formal tech lead, I had one person, right? So it was actually relatively, and the person is, the same level as me. So it was mostly like a peer relationship, except that I was named the tech lead. So sometimes I have to make decisions or to do things that are more external facing. That actually helped me. I think when you are formally named a lead on the project, I used to think it doesn't matter, but it does, in the sense that if you're formally named a lead on the project, you're the main contact. So sometimes when external dependencies comes, they have to talk to you. And it's interesting because I think that actually helps me think about things in a bigger picture, right? Like how am I supposed to represent my project and describe the project to outside world so that they understand what my project is doing. From that, now I'm taking on more people on my team. So it's similar, right? Like I am the main contact person on the team. That transition kind of happened that way. And how do I divide work? I think this is something I actually probably need to learn more. I feel like in the teams that I have been, I think I've been lucky that most the group members I work with, no matter more senior or junior than I am, people are eager to take on work. So a lot of time it's just to make sure you make people aware what work are there, and then nudge people in the direction, because you don't want everyone to work on the same thing, right? So you want to make sure you think about what their skill set, what they're good at, but what they can learn, and based on those things, and also what the project need, right? To gently nudge people to do things that are useful for them and useful for the team. That's how I usually think about it. And the reason why I say I need to work on this a little bit more is that I think I tend to take on too many things myself. Like I think sometimes when things I feel like they're probably a little bit tedious, probably no one wants to do it, I end up just doing it myself, which is not very scalable. I am also like working on this a little bit more because I think one thing that's good for me is that people on my team, they genuinely want to do good for the team, right? So I think if I tell them that, hey, this might be a little bit tedious, but it will be really good if you can do this. I think if I tell people this, a lot of people will still take on the thing. Yeah, it's just something I need to learn and be more organized about.
That's totally not me. Like, I can't wait to give other people tasks. I'm like, yes, you want to be involved. You could do this, and scrape that data for me.
Yeah, I think that's useful though. I think it is useful. It's one thing actually, in Google research, I think there tends to be we tend to hire more senior people, I think. But I recently hired a few more junior folks on my team. And I think it's actually really good because I actually genuinely feel like even there are some tasks that might be not as interesting to more senior members, but I actually genuinely think there's some tasks that can help junior members, right? So for starter project, I tend to give people things that are not necessarily not interesting, but like they're interesting, but they also help them to understand the project more. So I think for me, it's almost like convincing myself that I am not just giving people things that I don't want to do, but I'm trying to connect that with how they can grow. And it could be something that's uninteresting to me, but it could be like something that actually helped them to grow at the time. And I think if I can convince myself I'm giving them something that will help them, it usually makes me much easier to give them work. Yeah.
No, that definitely makes sense. Anyone else wants to ask a question like verbally and not in a chat?
Hello, this is Lipsa here. I'm a senior software developer at VMware. I had a question about switching from a regular, like a generic software developer roles to machine learning engineering roles. Mm-hmm. So do you think that when we do the switch, we kind of start beginner in the ML engineering field, or do you think that the skills that we learned as a software engineer, for me, I'm currently a senior developer. So do you think that would matter when I join as an ML engineer? Do I have to start as a beginner?
You mean like from your current position where you don't do any machine learning, if you want to be hired as a machine learning engineer?
That's right.
I think it really depends on how big your organization is, what the need is, right? Like the reality is if you haven't done machine learning and if you go to a company like, LinkedIn or Google, where there are a lot of people who have the machine learning expertise, you will probably likely have to be hired as a more entry-level person, just because if that's what your job description is and you don't have experience, then it's actually not unfair. If you want to be doing that job, you are probably at an entry level. But the reason why I said it depends is like when I went to the startup, I was hired as, I think, I was the 5th software engineer on the team. At the time, people didn't really know what, they're still figuring out what they're doing. And I think within a few weeks I joined the startup, I realized that actually the startup really needs some front-end people. And at the time, out of the 5 or the 6 of us, only one other person has done real front-end engineer work. So that's when I said, hey, I actually really need to learn this, right? So usually if you ask me, for example, with my experience, if you say, if I want to be a front-end engineer, what level should I be? To be honest, at this time, if I actually go out and say I want to be a front engineer, I have to be a super entry level person. But because I joined the startup and then they hired me at a reasonable level is matching my experience at the time, they hired me at that level, but I was doing front end engineer, which I was basically an entry level for. On the other hand, it was a small company, right? So it wasn't like they have a lot of other people at the time to do front end engineering. So it was fine. And actually that was one of the reasons I left at the end of 2014 is by the time I left, they actually hired a group of people who are experienced in front-end engineers, right? Like in terms of engineering experience, they're probably overall not as senior as I am. But at the end of that, my experience there, they have a team where there are front-end engineers more experienced than me. And so I was looking at it, I'm like, it doesn't make sense for me in that company to be doing front-end engineer. And at the level I am, I feel like I'm not contributing at the level I was hired at. So what I'm trying to point out is that it is definitely possible that you, without much industry machine learning experience, you could be hired as a machine learning engineer, maybe at a higher level, but that probably will mean you might be going to a company where there are relatively fewer other machine learning engineers with more experience. So it's just something for you to consider how you want to learn, what the level that you want to be.
Got it. Thank you. Do you have any suggestions on like how to get started? I know that you said that it is advisable to join a team which which is doing ML work.
Mm-hmm.
But for you to get hired as an ML engineer, they might need you to have certain skills, right?
Right. So that's why I think I said learn on the job. I think there are multiple ways to think about it, right? Like I have friends who their background is more infrastructure. One example is I know someone who was more infrastructure background. She wants to come into Google Research. And I told her the best way is to find a job that is more, is machine learning, but more focused on the infra side. Like they have more need on the infra side. Our titles are all software engineers. So I don't think she had to like switch to machine learning or engineer or anything, but she basically transitioned to the team, and it's a team that works on machine learning, but was able to use more of her skills. So I think if you are changing to another company, yeah, it depends. I think if you are able to, for example, if your background is infrastructure, I would recommend you look into more a machine learning infrastructure team to start with, because I think that means that you can continue to use your infrastructure skills, and at the same time, the team will have more exposure of machine learning. But on the other hand, that's a little bit more indirect, right? So I think the downside of that is that I know many people who went through that transition end up feeling that they're still doing the same thing. So I think it would depend on the team. Again, I think transitioning always takes extra time. Like no matter you take classes, no matter you learn, quote unquote, learning on the job, usually this means that you probably still do the job that at your level that you're doing, and at the same time you try to learn on the team. So it's usually always more than 100% of your time almost. So yeah, transition is not easy. It's finding the most smooth way, but it's always going to be extra work.
Got it. Thank you so much.
All right, folks. Then I guess we could say bye.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care, y'all. Bye.